This video may have a tiny bit more substance to it, and the only reason I'm making it is not because I really ultimately disagree with Salvatore about anything pertaining to programming or concepts or whatever. I frankly think he probably understands them much better than I do. But there's too much for me to say to put in a written comment. I want to review for a moment the reason that I made the video on object orientation. And I stated it at the time, but I want to kind of close that loop here as part of this discussion, is that I was a trainer for many years teaching people about object orientation. And I discovered that people who already knew about programming had the difficulty of taking what they already knew procedurally, which I'm now going to assert is probably based to a higher degree than object-oriented programming on a physical visualization of the computing process. In other words, I think at one time people taught programming, think like a computer. Object-oriented programming is very distant from thinking like a computer. But when you're trying to make the transition, the problem has always been you know how to program procedurally, and now they come up with this other stuff, and the question is, how does it tie to the concepts we already know? And one of the problems that I've encountered is that when you're learning object orientation, it in fact appears to be more complex, appears to add more overhead, at least to your own thinking process. And the question I have explicitly or implicitly gotten from people from time to time is, why should I go to all the trouble to make an object when I can just do this thing with a function or a procedure? And why should I make the computer go to all the trouble to create this object when I just want to perform a calculation? The answer to that is understood if you do understand that the object is merely the data. Now, the data has limitations placed on it as far as what operations are valid, but the object is just the data. When you create a new object, you're not imposing any huge burden on the computer. And for people who already think in terms of the physical operation of a computer, this is something that I think almost has to be addressed. Now, Salvatore says, basically, I wish I had it pulled up here, but, conceptually, the accurate representation of the concept is what is important. And I'm going to disagree with that, and I think I disagreed with it early in my videos. It isn't being technically, perfectly, conceptually correct that is important in teaching object orientation. It's getting people to buy into it. And getting people who are procedural to buy into it requires that they understand that there's really very little going on with the creation of an object. And the distinction between an integer as an object and an integer as data, I don't think there is one. An integer is data in a computer. Now, the reason I'm kind of passionate about this, beyond what the topic merits, probably, is that I had a discussion with somebody that I don't think I related earlier. We had both interviewed for a job, which we, at different times, and we'd gotten them. We worked together. And we were discussing our technical employment interviews, and one of the things that I mentioned was that someone that we now both knew said, what is an object? And I said, data. And my friend said, and he let you get by with that? And I said, yeah, he didn't ask anything else, and I got the job, so I guess it must have been a reasonably satisfactory answer. And he and I disagree with whether that's a good answer, and I think it is the best. I actually think it's ultimately the only answer, conceptually or not. An integer is an integer because there are only certain operations that can be performed on it, and it is stored in certain data, certain data representation, but that doesn't mean it's not an integer. As I say, we're not really arguing about any understanding, any difference in belief. We're talking about how to express things, and my expression is coming from the idea of a teacher trying to persuade people to grasp an idea. even if it means a sacrifice of some technical perfection. Um, I have something else to say about that. But that was the motivation for the creation of the video, and it was the motivation for the creation of the underlying spiel, which I have given many times in a class. Now, Salvatore also makes the observation that practically nobody who's a procedural programmer can ever become an object-oriented programmer, and he was being a little excessive in that statement, because I was a procedural programmer that became an object-oriented programmer, which is why I relate so clearly to the difficulty of doing it. The idea that it was an insurmountable burden was actually first articulated to me when I was teaching a class about object orientation once, actually to some employees of the state of Kentucky, for whatever it's worth. And at one of the breaks, I was conversing with one of the students who said, "Do you think I'm going to be able to understand object orientation?" I said, "Sure, why not?" And he said, "Oh, I'll tell you why not. I read an article that said that X percent, it was very high percent, whether it was 80, 90, wasn't quite 100, but it was close. Some percentage were just incapable of getting it. Once you were a procedural programmer, you were ruined. You could not grasp it. And so that is the purpose of part of my videos, is to show this correlation. And the technical pure perfection does not accomplish that goal. Insisting that an object is this mysterious thing, and denying that it's merely data, actually contributes to people not understanding, who have this other background. And as I say, Salvatore and I disagree about really virtually nothing, but my passion for how it is described comes from my background, my teaching experience, and trying to get people to understand it. Interestingly enough, I had another experience this week. The same fellow who I had the discussion with about our employment interviews, he and I coincidentally had dinner this week. We were in the same city. We do not work for that same employer anymore. We work for another same employer, and we both travel a great deal. And he and I had a previous discussion where my thoughts weren't as organized about it as I hope they are now. And it was with a similar type of dispute, and let me explain it. We belong to distribution lists at work, and I belong to a distribution list where a database guy wrote a question. I just don't quite get it. What is a .NET application domain? And somebody wrote him one of these technically accurate descriptions, which in my own mind I'm sure was not helpful to this guy. What he wanted to know is, as somebody who is a database guy, understands computers and processes, he probably is a programmer, but probably not highly into object orientation. He is probably more into viewing Windows processes and how things fit together. I was pretty sure the technically accurate description was not helpful. What he wanted to know was, in the view of things that I have about how computers work, where does this concept fit in? So after a while I wrote a different explanation, and I said that a .NET application domain was a virtual process, and that actually multiple of these virtual processes could live in a Windows process, because the .NET Common Language Runtime took the place of performing process isolation and doing some of the operating system functions. Now, this same friend of mine, I forwarded that answer to him, and he found it very unsatisfactory, because he said, well, that's emphasizing the wrong part, and that's not why they made this thing, and all that kind of stuff. I never did get back to him, but my point was, you just really don't get communication. Communication is taking an idea in my mind and putting it in somebody else's. If I take it and, by my insistence on being pure, send it to somebody else's mind and it doesn't get in, there is no communication. And also, ironically, at this dinner that we had, I asked him a question about an unresolved issue that he and I had had from a previous discussion, because he does understand the .NET framework far better than I do. And I had some questions, and when I basically said, well, why would you want to do a certain thing, the answer he basically came back with was process isolation, which did not strike me as humorous as it does now. Because that's what we had the dispute about before, and as a matter of fact, that was the motivation for me actually making the video on why do we have the .NET framework. So this just rounds back to the idea I made that series of video not for the object-oriented Illuminati. I made it for people to understand, and an insistence on the abstract ideas for people who view things in concrete computer terms, insistence on expressing it with the aura of mystery that object orientation has, doesn't do the communication. Ultimately, the ideas are the same. Ultimately, we don't disagree. It's just a question of how to communicate. And the reason I'm calling him Salvatore is because I didn't know how to pronounce his screen name. And so I went and discovered he had a website which shows that the S in his screen name actually stands for his first name. So, how are you, Salvatore? And as I say, we really ultimately disagree about nothing. But I'm just somehow wrapped up in the idea of getting a video out this afternoon that gets something off my mind so I can put a